We will have captioning enabled on Facebook. On the bottom right corner of your video, there will be a gearbox symbol, and you should be able to click that. And then there is a an option to turn on captioning as well during the event. I think we just have someone else joining us here. So I'm going to ask just everyone to stand by for a minute. We're just setting up the closed captioning right now, so if everyone could just stand by for a few minutes. So we're gonna play a short video for everyone while we set up the finish setting up the closed captioning. The video is captioned, and of course we have the sign language interpreter as well. So please enjoy the video, and we will be back shortly. Thank you.
Denise grew up with her disability.
I had the experience of not being able to get into most places that I.
Along with the civil rights and women's movements of the 1960s and 70s, the independent living movement in New York was growing. In 1978, the late Pat Figueroa opened New York's first independent living center. His wife Denise grew up with her disability.
I had the experience of not being able to get into most places that I wanted to go to, not being able to find accessible transportation. It was okay to discriminate against you, you know, to say you can't come in if you couldn't physically get into the building, or even not to serve people.
As ILCs began to open across the state, advocacy was a core service, leading to authorized state funding for the ILCs in New York. The movement was able to get the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act written into state law. It helped the nursing home transition and diversion program secure a Medicaid waiver, and was the driving force behind the Consumer-Directed Personal Assistance Program.
If you look at the CDPA program that started here in New York, it's really people with disabilities taking something that is a medical model and bringing it out into society. To me, that's a huge change.
In 2001, creation of a statewide systems advocacy network brought the movement's advocacy to a new level.
That took the power of a whole bunch of individual advocates and put it together to form a really tight and strong network of advocates that could work on issues together.
One ever-present issue is changing people's opinions and expectations.
It's couched in the sense that you can't do things. Even our language, when you say, you know, your car is disabled, it means it's not working, right? People don't expect us to go to work.
Folks in our communities feel oftentimes like second-class citizens. I myself am questioned on a daily basis if I need help. Can I, oh, you work, oh, you drive. I do all these things.
The widespread perception is not the reality. In fact, greater access helps everyone.
Well, the most sort of generic example, curb cuts. Curb cuts help everybody. It's not just a wheelchair user. It helps mothers in their carriages. It helps people, when they're trying to load a store or whatever, and they need, and they're pulling a big trolley or a big cart or whatever. It helps everybody, and that list goes on and on.
As does the advocacy go on.
One of our greatest needs right now is systems advocacy. And in particular, the managed long-term care system was not designed to provide support to the most disabled individuals in New York State. So many of our folks are falling through the cracks.
Getting people in the workplace with the support of government, with giving incentives to employers to employ people with disabilities is pretty key.
So I think attitudinally, a lot more work needs to be done.
I think it's really important to look toward young people with disabilities so that, we can cater specifically to them, but also really bring up the next generation of disability rights leaders.
And continue the movement to a place where perception is the reality. And
if you're developing a piece of legislation, you're going to automatically be thinking of the needs of people with disabilities along with everybody else whose needs you're trying to meet. You're going to automatically think of all of those things without anybody prompting you, without anybody trying to get you to see a vision that we see, because your vision will be ours.
Did you see what came in from Lauren? What is it?
Thank you, everyone, for standing by, and
Right,
we will be joined by Denise Figueroa, who will be our moderator for this morning's program. So take it away, Denise. Denise, I think you're muted right now.
The fun of Zoom, huh? Sorry about that. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the video. NYAIL put together that video, and I think it gives everybody a sense of the breadth of issues that that independent living centers are dealing with, working on, and the fights that we continue to have for full access for all of the members of the disability community. So today I'd like to introduce our panel. We have some great panelists here with us, distinguished people who have, all of them have been involved in the disability rights movement for many, many years. And uniquely, I get to say that they're all my friends. I have been friends with every single one of these folks, and it really is an honor to be able to introduce everyone today. Jim Weissman, and actually you guys can turn on your cameras, I think, while at least I introduce you, and then individually you can talk about your background.
I cannot start video because.
Judy, have we got you? Or is that Alex who needs to start?
Someone else has to let me in.
I think Alex needs to turn on your video. But first I'll introduce Jim Weissman. Jim Weissman is the CEO of United Spinal Association, and he is a longtime friend and former boss, as a matter of fact. I used to work for Jim at the Paralyzed Veterans Association. So Jim has been in the forefront of advocacy in New York City and in transportation, and certainly was one of the leading people, in fighting for transportation access in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Denise.
Here today. And next I'll introduce Judy Human. Judith Human is the, again, a friend that I have known since I was a teenager, and got to meet before all of this started, at the very beginning of Disabled in Action, and have known Judy, as I said, for all of that time. Judith, of course, has been not only involved in disability rights, the passage of Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and the ADA, but has also been a member of the administration for Bill Clinton's administration, as well as the Barack Obama administration, both as Assistant Secretary in Education, as well as State Department. So welcome, Judy. And as
Nice
I
to be
said,
here.
I will let all of you give a little bit more on your background. Cliff Perez, who I have known for 35 years as well. Cliff is the systems advocate for the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley. So we work closely every day. But Cliff is also the vice president of the National Council on Independent Living, and has been involved in the passage of the ADA since we started together, and certainly in other disability rights issues when he was a college student. And so we'll have Cliff talk about his background a little bit as well. So
thank you, Denise.
it really is, it is a pleasure to have all of you here today. And it's an exciting day to celebrate the Americans with Disabilities Act, the 30th anniversary, but not only to celebrate the anniversary, but also to talk about the future. And so we're hoping today that everybody gets a sense of how much we have accomplished, but also how much more we have to do. So I'm first going to turn it over to Judy to give us to talk to us about how you got involved in the disability rights movement. And I'm going to ask each one of you to do that. So after Judy, we'll have Jim, and then we'll have Cliff do that. So Judy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I guess, Denise, I got involved in the disability rights movement for the same reason you did. We had polio and we were not being allowed to execute our lives like our families were doing for our non-disabled siblings. And I learned from my mother and my father as we were, going through life. My mom tried to get me into school, and that didn't happen because I was a wheelchair user. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I had polio in 1949. I used a motorized wheelchair, and didn't use a motorized wheelchair then because, as many of us know, motorized wheelchairs really didn't come into really being used significantly until the late 1960s, 70s. So as I was growing up and experiencing discrimination, being denied the right to go to school, didn't get to go to classes till I was in the middle of the 4th grade, was on home instruction, first, second, third half of the 4th grade, 2.5 hours a week. And when I finally did get to go to school, with segregated classes for disabled children in a regular school, but we never even ate lunch with the kids together. And then I'm in a film that many of you, I hope, have seen, called Crip Camp. And it's the story of disabled people who went to a camp called Camp Jeanette in upstate New York. And I think camps, for many of us, not everyone went to summer camps, but many people did. And you can see in this film really the growth and development of disabled campers in being able to really begin to look at disability in a way that we were experiencing it in our communities. Lack of opportunities being significant, lack of role models of disabled people, because even if we were in these segregated classes, we didn't really know adults with disabilities who were moving forward in a professional way that we could really look at. For me, it was a little the exception of getting involved with Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association in the late 1960s, where there were disabled veterans, mainly guys, who were doing great work. And that was really important, I think, for me and many others to see that work was evolving on disability rights. Pat Figueroa, the late Pat Figueroa, myself, Denise, others were involved with helping to set up disabled student services offices at the universities that we went to, which was also, I think, an important part of what was happening, because we were accepted to universities that were significantly not providing us with the supports that we needed to be successful on campus. There was no 504 or ADA or other major legislation at the federal or state level at that time. So you gradually see colleges, camps as grounds where we were able to begin to think about what did we want our futures to look like. And I think one of the other important components of what was going on was not only what did we want to see our lives looking like, but we really were valuing very much the fact that it was kind of a universal experience, that regardless of the type of disability you had, the denial of equal opportunity was pervasive. And so I think that's really a lot of what helped spur the independent living movement. I moved from Brooklyn to California and was involved with the establishment of the Berkeley CIL. It started in 1972. I was recruited by Ed Roberts to come out both to go to graduate school and get involved with CIL. So I've spent like decades of my life working in the independent living movement, and I think the interpreter froze. Okay. So we can get into talking about other things, but for me, really, it's been the growth and evolution of the voices of disabled individuals, cross-disability work, the expansion of our work so that we moved beyond the communities that we grew up in. And we grew up mainly, in my case, I grew up in a neighborhood that was a white neighborhood. The school and camp that I went to were more racially diverse. But I think one of the issues that have been going on over the last number of decades is not only looking at cross-disability and the intergenerational nature of disability and the importance of working with disabled people across age, but also to ensure that the racial and religious and sexual orientation of disabled people is a visible part of the work that we're doing. We all experience discrimination, sometimes double, triple discrimination based on our backgrounds.
Are you back there, Denise, or should you want me to just go?
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. My experience is, of course, different. I never thought about disabled people until I was a teenager, and I mean never. I didn't have any close friends or relatives with a disability, and if I did, it totally wasn't on my mind. And I was interested in not going to summer school. And my father said, if you don't get a job, you're going to summer school. And I couldn't drive yet. I was a teenager, so I was hot for this girl in the neighborhood who was volunteering at a day camp for disabled kids. So I got on my bike and I went over there and I volunteered. And, my life changed. I met contemporaries, people my age, teenagers with disabilities. And, they become your friends. It's not, it's who you hang around with, I guess. And so I had my high school friends and I had my, it's at what is called Viscardi School now on Long Island. I had my high school friends and I had the Viscardi School friends, and I always had them. And one of them was Paul Hearn. And Paul was homebound till he was 13. And when I met him, he was on a gurney and a body cast. And maybe he's 3 feet tall, maybe, but he was kind of Irish leprechaun-like. He had the gift of gab, that Blarney, I guess he'd call it. And he was a remarkable guy. You know, he was as funny as you could possibly be. And he drove. He had a license. So, I mean, you know, my mother couldn't believe it when she saw how he drove, that I would get in the car with him. But he had a beat up old Gremlin car with fenders that were so banged up and broken that nothing could happen to it. And I had a great time with Paul, and we both went to college, not together, but we were friends. And he was at Hofstra. And he beat Norm Coleman for student body president, the guy that went on to be the senator from Minnesota, the student body president when he was a senior. And he hitchhiked across Europe after he graduated in his gurney. And he just was, you know, he was fun to be with. I didn't think about his disability much, except when we go places, people would say, don't put him there. And I would say, he speaks, you talk to him, you know. Or he goes where he wants, you have to deal with him. And I wouldn't think there ought to be a law. I would think, what a jerk or something, but I didn't think the law should be, I wasn't thinking about it. And I went to law school, and I had a disabled guy in law school, who some of you may remember, Jose Vega, who was kind of he turned me on to using the law about disability. He had muscular dystrophy. He's been dead a long time, but I was watching, as I graduated law school, the 504 demonstrations. And I was supposed to be an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. And the city went broke and froze hiring. And I was furious that I would have to stay on. I was working there as a student, and I'd have to stay on in that capacity. And I was telling Paul about it, and he said, how'd you like to write a grant proposal and do legal services for poor disabled people who can't get into the offices in New York? And Senator Javits got us funded. Paul told this amazing story to me driving to Javits' office. He said, watch this, the negative presumption at work. And I said, what? And he goes, well, we'll get to Javits and he'll talk to you because I'm in a wheelchair and he'll think I'm a moron. And then when I speak up and I'm only as articulate as you are, he'll feel guilty that he thought I was a moron and do whatever we want. And it was like he scripted the meeting. That's exactly what occurred. Javits got $275,000 for us out of the Legal Services Corporation to do disability-related poor people's legal services. But in the door came landlord, tenant, domestic relations, welfare, all that stuff. But so did I can't get a job, I can't drive, I can't get on the train, I can't get on the bus, nobody will rent to me an apartment. The dorm is charging me double because I'm in a wheelchair. You know, there was all these systemic discrimination problems. And just to finish the answer, it caught my imagination. I realized this was a big civil rights movement about to, this is 1977. This is when it's like blossoming. And I met Judy then too, by the way. I remember when, you probably don't because you've met everybody in the world, but I do remember meeting. We had the strangest things happen. Bobby Mueller from EPVA came into our office at Legal Services talking about civil rights of disabled people, not about veterans, and making transportation accessible. And Terry Moakley from EPVA, it was an amazing time. All these people grew up in the time of civil rights movements. And the veterans were able-bodied until adulthood. They know how people treated people with disabilities. They treated them that way until they became people with disabilities. So nobody was ready to stay home and watch TV, and I got caught up in it. Frida and Michael, Frida Zames and Michael Imperiali begged me to go to a MTA hearing with them for funding, federal funding. And I went one evening to the Commodore Hotel on top of Grand Central Station, the old hotel that used to be there. And when it was, all they wanted was these little minibuses that they were buying for Staten Island to have lifts on them. To finally, this was 1977, to put lifts on buses. And when they started to testify at this public hearing, all the MTA board members talked to themselves and between themselves and got up and got coffee and went to the bathroom. It was like they weren't there. It was like a pro forma hearing, and we can disregard the needs and rights of people with disabilities with impunity. And it got under my skin, and it stayed there. And I felt like we have to do something about this. This is outrageous. But you have to acknowledge the humanity of the people speaking before you're going to make transportation accessible. That's for sure. And they weren't even there yet. And it inspired me to go. And I owe that to Frida, who got it. She really pushed me to do this. And we got involved in suing transit, and it galvanized and organized disabled people in New York City. Denise was a plaintiff in that case. And I've been going, doing this ever since.
Did you use 504?
We did not, because Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter put these great 504 regs out in '79. And that's when we sued them. But the American Public
77.
Transit Association.
The regs came out in 77.
The HEW regs came out in 77. The DOT regs came out in 79. And they required lifts on half the buses, paratransit until key stations and lifts on half the buses are accessible, and then no more paratransit. And the American Public Transit Association went crazy, representing all the transit operators in the country, sued the administration, got won in the lower court. Reagan got elected, and didn't appeal. So they went back to just requiring special efforts from transit authorities, which is undefined and is like their little girl kind of, just pat on the head kind of special effort. And it was infuriating. But that's not why we sued, and that's not why Denise was a plaintiff. The reason we sued was that New York City, when that reg came out, which was eventually defeated by the transit lobby, New York City ordered 900 inaccessible buses after publication of the requirement, but before the effective date. Ha ha, we beat disabled people. We ordered 3 times our average purchase to load up on inaccessibility before the effective date, and we were furious. So we sued them based on the New York State Human Rights Law and the New York State Public Buildings Law, because Reagan had totally emasculated transportation regulations by that, with Section 504. So, and we took kind of an alternate route to it, and we were able to enjoin subway station construction at 10 subway stations, but kind of luckily for us, MTA acted like it was every subway station.
Like it what?
It was every subway station. They threatened the legislature, and we're not going to renovate any stations unless you change the law. They stopped us and the newspapers, and the rest. Everybody was.
But everybody else doesn't, so say it.
Well, wait, we're only introducing how we got involved.
I know. But finish that strand.
Let's let.
No, but just, yeah. Sorry, but just finish that one strand, and then Cliff can talk.
Do you want me to finish that?
Yes.
Go ahead, Jim. Finish.
Well, what happened when we sued is that the newspapers and the politicians, there was one city councilwoman who spoke up for us, Ruth Messenger, one assemblyman, Alan Hevesy, and Vince Marchicelli, I think, was a disabled state senator.
Yeah, he was. Staten Island.
Spoke up. But the rest of them were our opponents. Not one newspaper was on our side. The editorials were all against us, including the New York Times, who just celebrated their 30th anniversary of the ADA with a great series. I wrote them a letter applauding them on the series and telling them they left out the New York experience and their sorry role in it, because the Times opposed us the whole way, the whole lawsuit. 5 years of litigation, the Times was on the other side, and as late as 1990, the Times was opposing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So all this enlightenment is very new from them, and if you think I'm bitter about it, I am, because it set back disability rights for years, because that's the conscience of liberal New Yorkers. And if you can get away with screwing disabled people on the Times editorial page, then it's going to be open season. And that is what happened. So I'd love them to acknowledge their culpability in this, but I know it's
You ought to write a piece about it and have them
I did write them a
down.
letter to the editor yesterday. I'll send you a copy.
Okay.
Because you'll be the only person who reads it, I guarantee you. But the sentiment at the time was that this was expensive folly.
Yeah.
And that's what we were confronting.
Thank you, Jim. Cliff, I'd like for you to take some time to talk about how you got involved in the disability rights movement. And then maybe after that, you can answer our next question, which is also, what are some of the struggles that you experienced in terms of passage of the ADA?
Well, mine was also very different. You know, we talk about diversity, and diversity applies to all of us, and you know, the way we grew up and our experiences. And for me, because of my legal blindness, I remember my mother first tried to send me, well, not tried, she sent me to Catholic school. And I don't think there was any acknowledgement, at least not that I know of or remembered, of my blindness when I went there. And all I remember is that Catholic nuns can be pretty cruel. It didn't help, of course, that I was then, and obviously I guess still now, that followed me throughout my life, was pretty active and apparently always seeming to get into some kind of trouble of one kind or another. So it wasn't long really before they determined that this wasn't working for me. And my mother was informed of, I was in Puerto Rico actually at the time, because we moved there in the late 50s. And so a large part of my childhood was in Puerto Rico. And there was only once, there was the school for the blind, you know. So for us, as we refer to an institution. And in fact, when I came to the Bronx in New York in '66, we went to a school that actually was called the New York Institute for the Blind. But anyway, so I went to the school, this institution for the blind in Puerto Rico. And for me, I mean, in an institution, things were very different because we were all legally blind. And because we were all legally blind, and because disability doesn't care what color you are or where you come from, I was exposed to a lot of different people, both when I went to school in Puerto Rico and then when I went to the institution in the Bronx, same kind of thing. Still an institution, meaning we're behind closed gates, and we slept and we lived there. And again, was exposed to a lot of different people. So I just grew up thinking that everything, that although we were different, obviously, because I was going to a different school than anybody else, it was only in the 70s. Think about being in an institution with blind people. Here comes 1973, the Rehabilitation Act gets passed. 504, obviously part of the Rehabilitation Act, gets passed along with it, obviously. And the strange thing about it in the Institute in the Bronx, New York, all of a sudden federal people descended onto our school. It was incredible. It was all of a sudden there were all these people with suits coming to our school with gifts. They brought toys for us. That's the way we saw it, because blind people needed tape machines. So they had these great Sony new tape machines. To us, it was awesome because, you know, from the point of view, I guess, of them, this was something that was supposed to help us with our education. Shoot, we were using that to record music and walking around playing music with our new tape machines. It was just great. And then, obviously, when I graduated, went to college, didn't think I could make it in college because I didn't really learn much in the Institute. I mean, the Institute was great for social things. I was involved in almost any sport you could think of. I've played baseball, I played basketball, I wrestled, I was in track and field, I did Olympic rowing, both sculling and sweeps of rowing. We did a lot. There was one good thing about the school that I went to in the Bronx was that we were very forward than other schools in that sense. And we did a lot of sports. We participated with sighted schools in the sports. I don't know if anybody recently, there was something on Facebook about Bell Labs creating this ball that when you pull the pin out, it beeps so that blind people could play softball or whatever with this beeping ball. When I saw this, it brought back memories because we were the test for all this at the Institute. I remember when the Bell Lab folks came to our school with these, what we call the grenade balls. You know, you pull the pin out and it would start beeping. Because we were very athletic and we did a lot of different sports, we were pretty good at this. And we smashed their balls almost, that didn't sound right, but we smashed the ball that they brought almost every single time. We always managed to hit it, and we hit it hard, and there goes the beep. So we're the ones really that helped them manufacture that, or at least improve that. So I graduated, went to college, didn't think I could make it, but I did make it. And in fact, graduated with honors from my associates, my bachelor's, and my master's degree in social work. And it was then that in 1985, I saw this ad for, I don't remember if it was the client assistance program, but I think I actually interviewed for the job that Denise ended up getting first. And the irony of this is that I actually interviewed for the job that Pat Figueroa ended up getting with the Commission on the Quality of Care, basically running the statewide client assistance program. So by the time I went back to this center, the Capital District Center for Independence, to interview for the client assistance program, it was Denise who interviewed me. And it was Denise who was the first person to believe in me. It was Denise and Pat Figueroa both who believed in me. In fact, I used to cause so much trouble, you know, doing the client assistance program. I say trouble, but I was doing the best that I could to advocate for people who, in my opinion, were not being treated right and were not receiving the services that they were entitled to receive. So I made it a point to actually get to know the Rehab Act pretty well so that I could do the most effective job possible to defend people, to ensure that they got these services. So I remember Pat calling me and saying that he would get these letters from the VR agency saying, you know, you need to do something about this guy. This guy is off the deep end here. And Pat said that those letters were trophies and he would put them up on the wall and he goes, he's just doing his job. So that's how I became involved. And through that, I got to meet everybody because of knowing Denise and having Denise as my supervisor. And then Denise became my friend. And that's how I met Judy Heumann and Jim Weissman and so many of the other names that you've heard Jim mention. I've met some of these folks as well. And so while working with CDCI, that's obviously, since I started in 1985, that was sort of the beginning of the birth, if you will, of the ADA language. And then at around, 88, 89, we were doing work to get people to provide testimony. We even got a hotel where we had a lot of people come and we recorded their testimony and sent it to Congress to support the efforts that Justin Dart Jr. was pursuing, obviously throughout the country, to get this monumental civil rights law for people with disabilities passed. And we played our role, both I and Denise, in gathering testimony and educating people. And that's how we also got invitations to the ADA White House celebration in July 26, 1990. So that's how I got started in all of this.
Thank you, Cliff. Let me get my video back on here. Thank you. Can any of you address what you think are some of talk a little bit about the organizing efforts. Cliff, alluded to the fact that Justin Dart was doing hearings around the country, collecting testimony from people. And yes, we had an amazing hearing right here in Albany that Cliff was involved in helping to get people to testify. The independent living centers were actively involved across the country. But, I don't know, Judy, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the organizing efforts, and then Jim and Cliff, anything you need to add.
Can I also suggest that Jim and Cliff turn your screens on, because we're having a conversation?
Yeah, that's fine.
And for me, it's bouncing around.
Yes,
Yeah.
Mom.
Yeah.
Here I am.
I don't even, am I older than you?
Telling everybody
How old
what
are you,
to do, right?
Yes, we
Anyway,
are
I
older.
think we each have our own stories, including you, Denise.
Yes.
So you were on the board of NYAIL at that time, right?
Yes, I was on the board of NYAIL.
And Marka was the chairperson.
Yes, she was.
Yeah, so maybe you could speak a little bit about what NYAIL was doing at that time, because I think the work that was going on with the ADA was both nationally driven and then driven at the state and local levels.
True. Yeah, NYAIL obviously was very involved in organizing, working with many of the national organizations that were based in Washington, D.C. NYAIL organized folks and brought them to Washington every year at our annual conference. Obviously, we had our legislative meetings and had our rallies, but we also used that time to, I think it was in '89 that, it was in '89 that we had our march to the White House in the pouring rain. As a matter of fact, my daughter was only 4 months old, and Melissa was under a poncho, strapped to my neck there. And we marched from the hotel to the White House in the pouring rain. That was actually, I believe, the time when Marka picked up the phone at the gate of the White House and asked to speak to the president. And she was shocked to actually get somebody to respond. And although she didn't speak to the president, we ended up getting a meeting out of that effort. It's amazing the things that you do, and you don't think you're going to have an impact, but it had a tremendous impact, because it was an opportunity to set up a meeting with staff at the White House and talk about the concerns we had. We knew that we had supporters, Lex Frieden and Evan Kemp, who were close to the president and who were, working on the inside. And
the president had already said he was going to support it when he was campaigning.
Right, and then
for president, and then didn't support it when he got elected.
Exactly, yeah. And so we were making him deliver on his promise, is basically what we were doing. And so we were organizing people, getting information out to the independent living centers through our regional rep network. As much as the lobbyists were in Washington and the folks at the national level were helping to write the legislation, it was the independent living centers that were providing the bodies for those, for those demonstrations and for the actions that were being taken, as well as the Capitol Crawl. ADAPT and NYAIL were involved with that.
And Jim, what was going on with the veterans community?
This
At
was
that point where you were at EPVA?
I left legal services for a very short stint in what became the New York State Advocate for the Disabled's office, working for Governor Carey, and then I went to EPVA. Mostly because my boss told me off in front of Terry Moakley for supporting the rights of these people with disabilities. And I went to the men's room, and Terry said, "Are you going to work here?" And I said, I can't I just started. I'm not quitting. Where am I going to get another job? My wife is pregnant. Whoops. My wife is pregnant. And next day, Jim Peters called, and I went to EPVA. So I
Jim
actually
Peters
got
was the director of
of
Eastern
EPVA.
Paralyzed Veterans Association,
Yeah.
for those of you who didn't
Yeah.
know him or didn't even know the organization because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, we became United Spinal Association. We got a bigger mission and membership, but I got involved in the ADA when the National Council on Disability was I guess Paul was working there and Lex Frieden was the chair and Reagan charged them with
Lex was the executive director.
and the other way.
Yeah.
And Reagan charged them with writing this report towards independence. And it was like, what would be pie in the sky for people with disabilities? What's the best thing we can do? Like, what does America need? And they wrote it in good faith. And then Reagan accepted it and said, give me it in statute form. And Bob Bergdorf, who worked for the National Council, drafted it. I got involved right then because Paul was saying to me, they're crazy. They think they're going to make the space shuttle accessible. I remember that was his exact words. And we did get involved with it right away because there were no transit people that would help the disabled side. They would only help, the experts would only help their customers, the consultant types. And so I had already beaten New York and Philadelphia to the extent of key stations, lifts on buses, and paratransit. The stuff that was in the old reg, a little better than what was in the old reg that Reagan repealed that I was referring to. So it was the next 2 years was, constant trips to Washington, debunking the same things we had to debunk on the local level when we were doing this. It's the same thing, re-educating. And I know that everybody feels that way when they do disability advocacy. They fix this problem over here and the same problem pops up over there. This was very much like that on a policy level. You thought you'd educated people, but no, they really don't get it. The head of the Transportation Committee in the House, who was a Democrat, Bud Schuster, opposed accessible transportation. His Surface Transportation Subcommittee Chair, Norman Mineta, supported accessible transportation. So we were in that wedge, pushing hard, and Mineta was a champion, frankly. He stood up to Schuster, and he was also the mayor of San Jose. So he had a community of people with disabilities he knew. And exposure is everything. And we kept telling Congress that. If you know this, you'll be on our side. If you just open your mind a little bit, you'll be on our side. But it was hard in the beginning. The vote doesn't matter. The vote is after they knew it was going to pass. So the final tally is irrelevant. It was very controversial. And believe it or not, on the day of the Capitol crawl, remember that was March, the bill was signed in July. So it's only a few months. On the day of the Capitol crawl, that was the day finally we knew we were going to get lifts on buses. There was a subcommittee hearing, I forget what committee. I remember coming out of it and saying to Mark Johnson, I think the act's going to pass. These people don't have to crawl up the steps. Mark Johnson was an ADAPT leader, still is. These people don't have to crawl up the steps. The act's going to pass. I had no idea I was trying to stop the most iconic thing disabled people had ever done in the United States. When I was saying that, Mark was very bitter with me. What are you talking about? He was very angry at me. And then 5 years ago, that got written up in a book somebody wrote that I said that and he remembered, the guy looked it up to see what meeting it was and said that I was in fact right when I told Mark that. But I told the guy I had just what I told you. I had no idea I was trying to stop an iconic moment. At the time, I just thought these poor people are crawling up the steps. That's all But Liz Savage really organized the grassroots lobbying. She was remarkable.
Sorry, what was the name?
Liz Savage.
Oh, Liz Savage.
Yeah.
So Liz Savage, for those of you, is a disabled woman who lives in DC. She moved here in the 70s. And I believe at that time she was working for the Epilepsy Society.
Epilepsy, yes.
And she was, and she still works at the Justice Department, was kind of a real behind the scenes and
unbelievable.
Used to be a behind the scenes, total nitty gritty kind of person.
Absolutely a workaholic. She organized, she said, I need somebody from Louisiana. I need a disabled veteran from Louisiana to testify about why they need lifts on buses. And we got a guy, I still remember, Perry Tillman, his name was, from New Orleans, who basically said, I didn't bargain for this when I went to Vietnam. I didn't. This is not what I want. But it's my life. And you have to put lifts on buses. I have to go to work. I want to raise a family. That kind of thing. And these kind of messages coming from somebody's home district were really moving with some people. But Schuster, on the other hand, threw everybody out of his office that wanted lifts on buses. And they were he said, I'm not talking to you. You're not from my district. So we bought, I think it was Altoona, Pennsylvania. We brought people from Altoona with disabilities. He threw them out too. It was the grassroots thing, though, was an amazing effort, amazing. And it culminated in that thing Cliff referred to on the lawn. Those were the people that made this happen. The roots of it were right there.
I didn't go to the signing.
You didn't?
Nope.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that. I thought you were there.
Wow. Nope. Cliff, you go and then I'll tell you why. But I want to just say that one of the important things for me about this discussion is it's very important that find the people in your communities who have been involved in 504, ADA, and other things, because these are strategically important stories.
Very true.
You mentioned earlier about Liz Savage, who, by the way, is also considered one of the mothers of the ADA, along with Pat Wright, who worked for DREDF, Disability Rights Education Defense Fund. But Liz Savage was very big also in making sure that the ADA addressed alternative dispute resolution. And in fact, she contacted me and others to go down to Washington. I think it was 1991, I think, but I'm not positive. And so that a few of us could sit down and start talking language that would go into the regulations to address alternative dispute resolution, because I was already a recognized dispute mediator in New York. So I had been doing that for a while. And that's the reason she had contacted me to go down to Washington and help out with some of that as well. So that's more also of my involvement, more direct actually, with the Americans with Disabilities Act as well.
Judy, you didn't talk about your own experiences in terms of
my role.
Yes.
So I think, I was involved, across the years, moving out of 504, which I think we actually don't speak enough to. And a lot of the things that we attribute to ADA, like education, really is attributable to 504 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Correct.
And I think knowing our history and the laws and the impact the various laws have had is really important. And for me, one of the issues around education is when I was speaking at Harvard a couple of years ago, and one of the deans got up and said, yeah, that they hadn't done what they needed to do and they were working on it. And they've been obligated since, these are my words, they've been obligated since 1990. And I got up and spoke and said, no, you have not been obligated since 1990. You've been obligated till 1973. And the reason I think those distinctions are really important is we're talking about 18 years of amnesia on the part of many of the universities, because we are not demanding of them what they should have been doing since 1973. So I kind of get on a tirade about this because I think it is important for us as advocates to really understand that we need to keep pushing. And so I think for me, the ADA was the next steps. So many of us had been involved in the 504 demonstrations in New York when the Rehab Act was vetoed, and in many other activities, including the establishment of the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. And, for me, I was in the 1980s, I had left the Center for Independent Living where I was the deputy. I'd worked with Ed Roberts and another woman named Joan Leon to set up the World Institute on Disability.
Right.
I was beginning, and had been for a number of years, doing more international work. So I was kind of working on the ADA, attending meetings that Lex and Justin and Bob Bergdorf had organized in DC as they were beginning to have discussions around the ADA, what it would look like. And then I was working with Pat Wright and Arlene Mayerson and Liz and Marilyn Golden and others, Marka, et cetera, as we were strategically looking at moving the ADA forward. The ADA, even though it wasn't yet law, was something that we were discussing internationally because it really was focusing on 504 was great, but it only covered federal. It didn't cover the private sector, and really getting a better understanding of our need to be able to effectively lobby or educate. And one of the big issues going on in the 70s and 80s and still today is the ability to work cross disability. So I think a lot of the work that, the centers, most of which really are cross disability organizations, were playing an important role because kind of models of what needed to be happening. I mean, there were many national organizations, United Cerebral Palsy, the ARC, epilepsy, many that were also really working on this and were bigger and stronger than the National Council on Independent Living, which was just really forming. I mean, Nickel didn't have its first executive director till when? Mid-80s?
Well, no, actually it was when I was president. So it was in probably 92.
That Anne-Marie got hired?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can really see how things were changing and how the role and voices of disabled people were emerging. And I think much of the work going on with ADA really helped facilitate that, or we helped facilitate that. I think, as everybody's been discussing, getting disabled people who would be the spokespersons on issues was very important. And I testified at the hearings in 1988, the joint hearings, which I think they had like 52 speakers. And I was not in the central DC core of people, although I spoke with them a lot. And I didn't go to the signing because I was very upset about a particular provision in the law on personal assistance. In the law, it says that you do not have, makes me cry all the time, you do not have to assist someone in getting their coat on and off, eating, or going to the bathroom. And it was something that I had had pretty heated discussions with people about, and I was told it would be a breaker on legislation. Whether or not it would be a breaker, who will ever know? But for me, I clearly understand that legislation is compromise, but and I didn't want to get into a debate about which was more important. Obviously, it was very important that sign language interpreters and appropriate accommodations, except for blind and low vision people, were a part of the law. I think that was great. But
Well,
I
Judy,
ultimately feel that this provision didn't get in there because non-disabled people don't want to think about people needing help with basic things like going to the bathroom and eating and getting your coat on and off. And it took until 2016, where under the Obama administration, I was able to convince Guy Feldblum, who worked with other people, to get the 501 regulations, which only deal with employees in the federal government, to say that yes, it's a practice that the federal government should have so that people can get the service. But that's ultimately why I didn't go, and I didn't speak about it because I thought the bill itself was so important, but it has pissed me off for decades. I'm sorry.
Judy, we had something similar to that in the Act for People Who Are Blind. And the 1989 version of the ADA, Title IV, had a whole section for accommodating people who are blind and visually impaired, and all that was taken out as well. And if I remember correctly, I think the NFB opposed the signing, or not opposed, it didn't go to the signing of the ADA precisely because of that as well, similar to what you just said.
Yeah. Huh. I didn't know that.
One other story we should tell about someone who wasn't there, which was Guy Feldblum, who was the legal brains of the disability side of the ADA. She's a remarkably smart person.
With Arlene Mayerson.
Yes, and I mean, but Heidel, she wasn't there because she works, blah, blah, blah. She worked for the ACLU AIDS Rights Project. And President Bush, who, I mean, we got to give him his credit, that Bush won. Without him, this would have been an impossibility. So right. We got to give him credit. But President Bush was at that time talking about card-carrying members of the ACLU, as if it's like the Communist Party. And she was banned by the White House from the signing, even though she was so instrumental in the drafting. I would go to meetings with her and she would have these loose leaf notebooks, 4 or 5 inches thick, and she'd carry them around with all the notes. And once I said something like, there's a case like that, a 504 case. It's a cop with a seizure disorder, a history of seizure disorder, and I'm pretty sure he won the case. And she went, oh, Duran versus Tampa, 222 Fed sub 3. You know, she knew the citation to find it off the top of her head. She was just a remarkable person to have assisting. And of course, Arlene from Dredif, too, who was long distance all the time. Yeah. But it was amazing. But the beauty of, or the pain of being in New York is that you can go back and forth to Washington in one day, or, you know, in a very painstaking, torturous way. But you can do it. And so I was back and forth for 2 years doing it. I felt, though, Judy, that one thing that I wanted to comment on that you said about Section 504, I do think that that is the genesis of most of this. But I think that did my camera just go off?
Yeah, it did.
Oh, I'm on low battery. I'm going to have to switch implements. But I'll fix it in 1 second. But the one thing I want to say is that the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, and now called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, should have really done this too. The mainstreaming, if it was done effectively, mainstreaming, and it still hasn't, I guess, would remove all the stigma of disability. And that's what I believed would happen. I was obviously wrong, but that's what I believed. I'm going to hang up and call back in, Denise. I don't know what's happening with my battery, but it's dying.
Okay.
Plug it in.
I know. It's so low, I don't think that's going to save it. I'll call you in a minute.
So I mean, I definitely agree that that is another story. You know, 504 came out with the education language, and 504, like other civil rights provisions, has no money. When the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act came out in December of 1975, the obligations were very similar to the rules that came out under 504. One of the major differences, however, was that EHA, now IDEA, had a formula so that states would get funding if they agreed that they would comply with the law. And it actually took from December of 75 till I believe 1982 before every state had signed on. I think the last state to sign on was New Mexico, because they were all finally realizing that they had these obligations. And if they didn't take the money, they still had the obligations, which was, and I think Jim is completely right. And you hear about it now, and those of you listening who are younger or have younger people on your staff or are working with younger people in your community, it's very frequently their stories about how they went to regular education. And, you know, unlike Cliff and myself, Cliff's story, like blind, wheelchair. But outside of that, you know, little education going on, right? Kind of trying to struggle through what we weren't being taught.
Yep.
And now for those kids who are able to really get into the least restrictive environment and are able to be in reasonably decent schools, you know, you're seeing these young people move on to college and get jobs in areas that when we were growing up and before ADA were really unheard of. And so we have a terrible unemployment rate, which COVID is only going to make worse.
Right.
But I think it is really important to see that 504, EHA, IDEA, and the ADA together have really been making a significant difference in our lives.
So speaking about COVID, we should move into, I think, some discussion about what the impact, you know, we've talked about ADA and the accomplishments of it, but with the advent of COVID here, COVID-19, the impact on people with disabilities and people who are marginalized, you know, it has really been heightened, I think, and we've become enlightened about some of the issues that maybe the general public wasn't aware of. And I don't know which one of you would like to begin to speak about it. But Cliff, did you want to?
Why don't you start speaking about it, Denise?
Because I'm moderating the panel, Judy.
I know, but we agreed that you'd also speak. So why don't you speak, and then why doesn't Cliff speak?
Thank you. Okay. Well, Cliff, we'll start with you, and then I will speak to it. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, clearly, and I say clearly for us, this virus has, I think, shined a real bright light on the whole institutional bias, or more specifically, the institutional horrors that have been going on, but perhaps not as visible. And this virus has made that so much more visible, to the point where, of course, we of course are talking about the fact that we need home and community-based services, right? So that people have a real choice as to whether or not to go to an institution like a nursing home or others, or to actually remain in their own home, if that's even possible. But it cannot be possible if we don't provide home and community-based services, if we don't provide long-term services and supports. And these are the things that are becoming a lot more visible. But unfortunately, the others, the people in power, are still not getting it. And they're talking more about, oh, what can we do to strengthen or to enhance nursing homes so that we can continue, of course, down this road of institutionalization, down this road of denying people choices, rather to, you know, as to whether they should live in the community or be locked up in these institutions of which they can't get out once they're in. So clearly that has been one thing that this virus has shined the light on.
Alex, I hate to interrupt, but I'm trying to get in on my other device and it won't let me in.
We can see you.
Yeah, but I'm on the old one now. I'm about to run out of
Oh,
chips.
let me see. I'll see if I can let you in, Jim.
Okay, I'm gonna get off this one and come in on the other one, and I apologize to everyone for torturing
Sure.
you guys.
Do we want to take a break? We do have a video we can show, and that gives us about 7 minutes. So
We can do that while Jim gets set up. Yes,
Yeah,
if you'd like to
sure.
do that.
Okay.
That'd be perfect. So this is a video, actually, a United Spinal video that Jim provided that goes over some of the history as well of United Spinal. But it's a good cross section of issues related to accessibility. And we will turn off our cameras.
For millennia, people with disabilities were warehoused and ignored. They lived in people's basements or attics or back rooms, and people took care of Uncle so-and-so or Aunt so-and-so, but they were not gainfully employed. No one expected people with disabilities to be gainfully employed. The World War II veterans who founded this organization did not want that kind of a life. When people came home from war, or when people were disabled, congenitally or traumatically, there was not a community support system to keep them living well in the community. Organized groups of people with disabilities, including paralyzed veterans, made the need clear to government and expected government to respond.
As United Spinal built its reputation, the organization's mission was galvanized by a new leader, James J. Peters, a civil engineer and second lieutenant in the U.S. Army who was spinal cord injured in 1967. Peters exposed the harsh conditions facing paralyzed Vietnam veterans at the Bronx VA hospital in a Life magazine cover story. The report caused public outrage, which led the VA to begin to address the needs of paralyzed veterans. Within 10 years, the hospital was renovated and later named in honor of Peters.
Jim Peters cared about the person with a disability. If you had a disability, he'd try to find a job for you. He'd create a job for you if you didn't have one. If you came with a systemic problem, he'd call the staff together and try to change the systemic problem, and couldn't believe that you couldn't fix it. Once it was on his radar, you had to solve this problem. And many problems were solved that way because he just wouldn't take no for an answer.
With its roots in New York City, United Spinal began to focus on a variety of problems facing the disability community. It played an instrumental role in improving the city's mass transit systems and developed programs to make the built environment accessible to all.
New York City is our showroom. Frank Sinatra, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. What we've done here, many times the first time in the world, shows that it can be done anywhere. We took an old rail city and got them to agree to make transportation accessible. In 1979, we sued New York City Transit to make buses and subways accessible. No one agreed. The litigation went on for a few years. We got an injunction to stop subway station renovation unless they made them accessible. We did it. 50% of taxis had to be accessible by 2020, an agreement we made in 2014 that would change the face of transportation in New York City.
United Spinal was called upon to help draft portions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This landmark civil rights law prohibits discrimination based upon disability.
If you ask me what's the most significant thing I've ever done, I would say participating in there's two. There's a tie. Participating in the drafting of the Americans with Disabilities Act, because I never dreamed of something like that. And getting New York City to agree to put lifts on buses. So I got involved with the national group that was lobbying for ADA. And it was an exquisite coming together of people who were of one mind about the needs and rights issues. And 22 months, start to finish, from concept to statute. I don't think I've ever done anything better or faster with greater people. And we're about to have the 30th anniversary.
United Spinal has used the ADA to not only advocate for improvements in transportation, employment, and accessibility, but to promote the integration of people with disabilities in all aspects of our society.
When United Spinal became United Spinal, when it decided to open its doors to everyone with spinal cord injury and disorder, we had to change our priorities. It was going to still represent disabled veterans, but it's also going to deal with disability policy nationally. It's also going to organize chapters around the country to deal with disability policy locally. And it's also going to speak directly to the community of manufacturers and vendors of equipment for people with disabilities. United Spinal Association sees as part of its mission developing the next generation of leadership. There was a core group of disability advocates that existed in the late 70s, early 80s that pushed the disability rights movement over the finish line if the finish line was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there have been great leaps and bounds in promoting the rights of people with disabilities since the Americans with Disabilities Act, largely because it passed. But it is imperative to develop that next generation of leader.
United Spinal's initiatives have paved the way for future generations of people with disabilities to live with a greater quality of life and independence.
Well, thank you for the video, and I think we have James back on the Zoom meeting here, so we can resume our questions. We were talking before you left, Jim, or right after you left, about the impact of COVID on the disability community and the issues that that it has raised, and I thought that you could begin if we can get your video back up.
It says, can you hear me, Denise?
Yes, we can.
It says the host is blocking me.
Okay.
Oh, now he's asking me to start, it says. Okay.
It's
I'm
always
still on
fun.
the bad device because I can't get in on the other one. So I hope I don't run out of gas here.
Well,
I'm sorry, Denise. I got
No.
confused. What were you just saying? I'm being technically challenged. Go ahead. What was?
These meetings are technically challenging. It's okay.
I'm usually a little smoother.
Yeah, I try to be. But anyway, we were talking about COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on the disability community and some of the
You know
issues.
what happened yesterday, Denise?
Yeah.
Yesterday, on Sunday, I had an op-ed in the Daily News. And it said in it that one of the lines in it, which I thought was almost like a throwaway, was that as we return to work, the ADA will be a guide for how to deal with people with COVID-related problems. We're going to have people come out of the woodwork that we don't know about with immune disorders or suppressed immune systems because of some condition that's hidden.
Yep.
And they're going to need to be accommodated. And the ADA is there for them. We're going to have people who are the spouse of someone on chemotherapy. And the ADA protects them too, with its association language that you can't be discriminated against because you have a disabled child or husband, even though you're able-bodied, you're protected by the ADA. So the same thing would be true if you're the spouse of someone returning to work. I mean, if you're returning to work and you're the spouse of someone who's ill or has a suppressed immune system or on chemo, the ADA is going to say, you're going to ask your boss who's calling everybody back to work, can I continue to work from home? Or can I have extended leave without pay? Or whatever it is you need. And if it's reasonable, they're going to have to do it because ADA is there and it's a guide to how to do it. So when I put that in the two lines in the article, which wasn't mostly at all about that, in the op-ed, I got a call from a law firm that represents defendants who get sued based on, among other things, ADA, who represents employers. They want me to come in and do I guess you'd call it like an in-service, or do it on a Zoom, I guess, not come in, for their lawyers about, see, there goes my camera because I'm running out of gas.
What, did you plug it in?
Yeah, I'm plugged in, but I'm down to 5% now. And I'm trying to get in on my iPhone, but it's not letting me.
But I don't understand why your phone isn't charging if it's plugged in.
It is, but it uses more juice than it's, than it's getting, I guess. But Alex, I'm trying to get in on my iPhone too, and it keeps saying that I can't get in.
I think this is a very important point that Jim is raising.
Yes.
And I think it gets to the bigger issue of the ADA 30th anniversary. I guarantee you go down the street, you ask 10 people what the ADA is. If 2 of them have even heard of it, and if any of them can tell you what it does, I'll give you $5.
The American Dental Association.
Dental Association.
What?
The American Dental Association.
Exactly. And the reason I'm saying this is people who have had COVID do not know what the ADA is. And just like many, many people with all other kinds of disabilities no longer know what the ADA is. One of the things that I feel we really need to be pushing is trainings like we had after 504 that started in 1978, and trainings that we had after ADA came in, where they were focused on trainings for disabled individuals and families, and trainings that also were focused on those entities that had responsibility not to discriminate. And I think that's really something we need to push in this campaign, because we have no idea the number of people who've had COVID who've been affected. And they may not even know that they may know that they had it, but we don't know when the impact of the virus is going to hit them. It may hit them right away. But like in the case, Denise and I having had polio, there were many people who had polio who maybe were told they had polio, but didn't really begin to impact them for numbers of years later. Or people who knew they had it, but the impact became stronger as they were getting older. And I think it's also, we should be looking at the Rehab Act and what needs to be happening, because my concern with the Rehab Act is there's a match required. Many states have not been meeting their match. And if they're not meeting their match, they're going to get less federal money. And there's not focus on COVID. And Jim's point is so very important that NYAIL needs to really get in front of this and look and maybe speak to your departments of public health to get a better understanding of who are the people who are knowledgeable, what kind of information can we be gathering, how can, because they're not going to release names, obviously, but can people who had the virus get information about disability rights organizations in their communities or at the state level, which they may not even think about, but as they're moving forward, they may think, oh, maybe I need to call this person because of a story like Jim was telling it. My niece had called me a number of weeks ago. She teaches at a university, and the exact situation came up where one of the students who has a disability and is living with her mother who didn't have COVID, but is immune compromised. And she was being told that she had to come back to school or take her courses online. And the courses that she needed to graduate were not offered online. So in my view, a perfect ADA 504 situation where it is completely reasonable for her This is my husband coming through our foyer.
Sorry.
Hey, how you doing?
Hello, guys.
Cliff and Denise.
Good.
Hi, Ori.
Yeah.
Wow. And
With Griff.
I know. The guy. Oh, there. Yes. Hi, guys. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Anyway, so I think, did Nickel discuss this at all this weekend or last week or whatever? Cliff, is Nickel discussing COVID?
Oh, most definitely, Judy. As I said before about nursing homes, that's a big deal
Right.
for us. And
But I mean, also people are getting it.
well, yes, that too. And in fact, some of our folks have gotten it that have been on my LNA committee, Legislative and Advocacy Committee. Todd Hollowell is one of them that was on is on our committee, and I believe he wasn't able to be at the conference because we believe he has some effect of the virus. As to the extent, I don't know.
I think that's the big issue. We don't really know what the impact is going to be on people, the after effects of COVID. And, as Jim was saying, it's going to have a big impact on folks being able to go back to work, possibly needing services that they never had before. And as you said, Judy, not knowing that they have rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really is going to be a challenge for our independent living centers to get in front of this, to get out there and start educating people about their rights again under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We all take it for granted, unfortunately.
Yes.
And not enough people really know what their rights are. And in the area of employment, as we know, people with disabilities are significantly underemployed or not employed. With 70% unemployment rate of people with disabilities, we're now adding to the population of people who may or may not be able to keep their jobs, or may get discriminated against because they had COVID, and fear of employers, that people aren't going to be able to continue to do their work.
Or discriminated against because they have a disability that could be affected by COVID and we don't want them to be out.
Yes.
So we're not going to hire them in the first place.
Yeah.
And even that, there's more than return to work. What about going to the store and you can't get near the cash register because they put so many objects in your way to protect the staff?
Exactly.
People are trying to do the right thing. I was at a store the other day that had an accessible entrance. They were limiting the number of people that they allowed in the store, 36 square feet a person or something like that. And they were counting the people that came in and out. And then the exit has 2 steps.
Yep.
Because they want you to come in and out different ways so that people don't pass it. They're not thinking about it.
Right.
We're doing a webinar tomorrow. I wish I knew the details, but I don't. But you can get on United Spinal's website, I'm sure, and find the info for businesses about what is your responsibility. And we're talking about the restaurant shouldn't put the tables outdoors in the disabled parking. I just saw that the other day. They've got this beautiful tent set, canopy set up, and it looks so nice with plants all around it. And they eliminated all the accessible parking.
Yep, or blocking all the sidewalks.
Block the sidewalk is very common.
No access.
Yeah, we have it right
here. People with low or no vision are used to doing the same thing the same way every day. That's how they're great at it.
That's right.
And when you start putting obstacles in their way, they're not great at it. And
we become more blind.
Yeah, right. And the obstacles are there, obviously, because they want to protect people. They're behaving in good faith, but they're making huge errors and eliminating clientele and discriminating against people with disabilities. I do think that there's going to be lots of this kind of disputes going on. People will say, well, COVID is a temporary disability. It may not be covered by the act.
Well, why wouldn't it be covered even if it's temporary?
I think he's just saying that that's what they'll think.
Oh, yeah.
We know better. As you said before about people not knowing about the ADA, we're like the in crowd.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is some great conversation. We do have some audience questions, so if you guys would like to take a few of those, we could start doing that.
Sure, we can begin to do that, Alex. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Doug. How can we transform our state agency infrastructure to understand and embrace cross disability?
Our state agency infrastructure? Is there some clarification on that?
I did not see clarification on that, but I think it's the kind of the interagency, how we have silos, within that system. So I don't know if there's any experiences at any other levels of dealing with, siloed communities. And,
does anybody want to address that? I mean, we certainly in New York State, we have we continue to have siloed service delivery, so that depending on the agency that you, depending on your disability and what agency you get assigned to, if you get assigned to an agency, particularly the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities or the Commission for the Blind, or if you're physically disabled, you may or may not be working with the voc rehab agency. The services, the Office for the Aging, there's still very little coordination, and we do have most integrated setting coordinating council that has not coordinated much of anything. It was created as a result of the Supreme Court decision in Olmstead, which says that people have the right to live in the most integrated setting appropriate, and it was based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was a lot of advocacy in our state to create this most integrated setting council, and unfortunately, that council, over the years, it's really not been very responsive. It's made up mostly of state agencies, and it has 6 public members. And so, we've had some impact in trying to get some Olmstead implementation plan. But with COVID, I think it has highlighted again the fact that people, we don't even know how many people with disabilities have been affected by COVID-19, how many people in the institutions have gotten it. We've heard the stories about people in nursing homes who have gotten it, but we still have a significant number of people with developmental disabilities in institutional settings. The ICFs, they refer to them as, these are group homes that are, like 15 people in a group home or more. It's an institutional setting. It's not a house. And so we are struggling to get information just out there about, who's been affected and, what they're doing to protect people. It's just highlighted the fact that living in any institutional setting is dangerous. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about that.
I mean, I think it moves forward also on what Cliff was saying and what we've all been talking about. And we still have not, and I think COVID may be an opportunity to allow people to see that the reasons we've opposed segregated living, whether it's a nursing home or an ICF or whatever the heck the label is the conditions in these places cannot be good. The mere fact that people are being segregated is obviously something that not only we don't support, but I think people are seeing the death rates of people living in these facilities, the risk to healthcare providers and their death rate. And if we can really get more public media to be focusing on this, because I think it's really important for the PBSs, the NPRs, the local channels, social media, to look more deeply beyond, you know, the horror of the virus and how it makes us all feel very vulnerable because it's something we can't see and touch. To really begin to think about the budgets that are being developed in the cities in New York and around the country, and the state budgets, and looking at whether or not the budgets that are being developed will in fact continue to result in people being institutionalized or being able to stay in the community. And there's so much going on. And I think NYCL's been playing an important role at the national level on this, and I assume that NYAIL and others are likewise doing it. But I do think strategically working with media in a more focused way to see if there are journalists that are interested in looking at this story of COVID from a disability lens, both for those who have had the virus and the discussion we were just having, the unknown of what happens long term for people who've had COVID, who may well have acquired a disability or be protected under the ADA because they're perceived of as having a disability, maybe only because they tested positive. But I think there's a much deeper discussion that we need to be looking at, and how to get the media to step up and do a better job of reporting. And I think also, you know, we're looking at the, 40 to 50% of the people who have died as a result of COVID who have disabilities, people with the quote unquote underlying conditions of diabetes and hypertension as an example.
And these are just some of the ones that have been reported. And you know that there's going to be many more that hasn't even been reported. And
Right.
At some point, we'll find that out and the numbers will be a lot higher.
Correct. I don't know. I thought I saw Jim back on. I'm not sure if he is.
Yeah, I saw him pop on for a second, and then I think we lost him.
Okay. Do we have more questions, Alex?
We do. Yep, okay. We've got a few more. So Audrey's asking, I'm wondering what the panelists' thoughts are around the Disability Integration Act, if there are any updates that they would like to share.
Anyone want to take that on?
But I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
You're back.
My understanding is that it's pretty much dormant. It lost a lot of support.
Yes, that's correct. And as a result of that, NYCL has backed off of that, and we're concentrating more on the bigger picture of the institutionalization. And as I had said before, on things like accessible housing, because without accessible housing, none of this will matter, right? And home and community-based services, long-term services and supports. These are our big concentration. If DIA happens to come along later on or whatever, and it has a positive momentum, we'll be right on that.
Congressman Pallone is not willing to move it from New Jersey.
And Senator Schumer's even backed off, and he's the one who introduced it.
It's his bill, right?
I also want to say, Cliff, on housing construction, are you also looking at people being able to get grants or loans to make modifications to where they're living now?
I think that's one of the things that's we have a committee on just about on everything, and so we have one on technology, and I know that those are some of the things he asked that some of the folks have been looking into, both from NYCL and both from the individual members that we have on NYCL when they go back to their respective states and their respective centers. So yes, that's definitely an issue we're looking at.
Yeah.
Any other next question, Alex?
Yeah, there are some people that are saying they had to refresh their browser window on Facebook, so I think they figured that out. I think it was just the video being a little bit slow there. So we had a question. We've yet to touch on Black Lives Matter, the disability justice movement in this discussion. How are each of you thinking about truly intersectional justice, and how is this affecting your work today?
I would like to step up just for a second. About a year ago, before all this started, United Spinal said we have to reach out to underserved communities. We're kidding ourselves if we think we're talking to the disability community. So we made a real effort with our board of directors, which is very diverse, both ethnically, not so much disability-wise. It's a majority by far of people with disabilities, but it's very ethnically diverse. We made a real effort to have our programs reach out to minority communities. We also consider the underserved to be those who are geographically isolated. And so we've made a big effort to reach them as well. I think that the intersectionality issues are not just the issues of today, but they're issues of the next 10 years of movement, of disability rights movement. Sure. We need to capture that enthusiasm and make it of the Black Lives Matter movement and awareness, and couple it with disability advocacy.
For me, the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think, recognizing that this movement has been around for a long time and that it's really exploded in many ways because of the terrible things that have continued to happen, but in such a very public way, like the murdering of George Floyd. It's had a very profound effect on me as a disabled person, because it's also allowed me to see how the Black civil rights movement and other movements really have emerged a lot over the last number of decades, and how we as the disability community are still nowhere near where other movements are for lots of reasons. But and the general public does not look at issues affecting disabled people of any race or disability or background the same way they are beginning to look more at other groups. So I feel that the Black Disabled Lives movement, which is emerging, is very powerful, because it really is also speaking about disability. And I think that we've been looking, the issue of diversity within the movement is something that's been being worked on for a long time. It is not where it needs to be yet, but I definitely think there is meaningful progress going on. And, looking at Crip Camp and the impact and the number of younger disabled people, many of whom are non-white, talking about issues and who are generally a part of the movement in their communities in many ways, is facilitating a discussion that I hope not only strengthens our movement overall, but I think our movement has to be embraced by other movements. I'm a Jewish, white, disabled woman. And for me, it's important that the Jewish community, that the women's community are doing much more to look at the barriers and their failure to really look at issues from a disability perspective are impacting the primary communities they represent. And so I think as we move forward, I think we really are also, or can be, an example for what other groups need to be doing. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, I think it's definitely doing more work in this area, but I think it is an organization that really can play a stronger role in really looking at how disability impacts across their membership and how together we can be doing more to really advance these discussions and make meaningful change, not just looking at the barriers and the problems, but we need to look at the solutions that are out there in education, in employment, in economic development.
Cliff, you want to address that issue?
Yeah, these are, this is the kind of thing we have been very vigorously addressing in NYAIL, even as far back as last year, long before the murder of George Floyd. We had a seminar discussion, if you will, on anti-racism and racism and inclusion at our NYAIL conference. And to the point that there were many people who felt offended, they were angry, they lashed back at some of folks from our board who participated in running this. In fact, our treasurers who ran one of the sessions on this has received probably more complaints than anybody in the history of NYAIL in a matter of just a few months because of the stand that we have been taking. We had sent out a statement in January also before all of this blew up for everybody else, addressing police violence against people of color. And as a result of all this, we also had training for the board. We contracted with a nationally known trainer on anti-discrimination, on equity, and she provided a training to the whole board. We also, as NYAIL, sponsored a located training and location in Georgia on racism and equity and intersectionality to assist independent living centers to deal with these issues. In fact, we had about, I think it was 63 to 67 folks from all over the country that attended that training. We also have a feedback system in our website for people to be able to present comments, suggestions, and ideas. We're doing it both, well, all three, we're doing three methods of this. We're doing it on our website. You can also send emails to comments@ncyl.org, or you can call at 202-864-4249. So we've tried to cover all bases of where people, in methods where people can provide input and ideas to NYAIL on how we can expand, and also obviously because of our role to help independent living centers and state independent living councils to address these issues as well. So we have been taking this extremely seriously.
But you know what, Denise?
Yeah.
The word bigotry, I'm comfortable using with disability-related discrimination. I don't think America's there yet.
No.
I just don't. Even though, let's take New York State human rights law, there's commas between race, sex, disability, right? I don't think disability is on that level with them. And I think that civil rights organizations have trouble, traditional civil rights organizations, Black civil rights organizations, have trouble being introspective about including people with disabilities. I don't think that they intentionally do this, but I think that we're not on that knee-jerk bigotry response that we want people to feel when they observe disability-related discrimination. Right. Wade Henderson, when he ran the leadership conference, gave us his conference room one day. I don't remember who the group was. It was disability leaders. And there was, we were interviewing the leaders of the gay marriage movement because they had done so much so fast, we thought, they captured lightning in a bottle. Maybe we can do that too. What's the secret? Interestingly, their response was, we do control the media, which I thought that was pretty funny. but Wade Blank told us as he was welcoming us and then leaving the room to let us use his conference room, he said, if you want to know what's wrong with your movement, take a look at who's in the room. And it was all white people. Mm-hmm. And when he left, everyone was, kind of nodding and saying, you're right. And when he left, someone spoke up and said, if we went into his boardroom how many disabled people would be at his board meeting? And that's what we should have said. But we felt so, white man's burden, white man's guilt rather, that we didn't respond that way. But on reflection, that would have been the appropriate response.
Mhm.
What are you doing? You're
But
right.
I think, this is a very interesting discussion. And I think in one real way, we've got to I agree, but we've got to get away from what are you doing? What are we doing?
Right.
And we really need to look at, and the reason why I raised this issue of the different parts of who I am is because as a Jew, it's been an issue that I've been involved with for a long time, working within the Jewish community on raising issues within the Jewish community about how disabled Jews are accepted or not accepted, both the physical environment and religious teachings and on and on. That to me has been very important because, it's something that is important to me. I am acknowledged in the community, as being a Jewish person. My disability is something that makes people, and I'm just saying me, but for many disabled people, in this case being Jewish, makes people feel uncomfortable. And really being able to look more deeply at cultural issues and because religious institutions are not required to comply with the ADA or 504. And I think, each one of us can look at groups that we've been working with and the kinds of changes that we've been trying to facilitate. And that's ultimately what I think we need to do. So when we look at our organizations and other organizations, I think the discussions really need to be now around what is it that we need to be doing? Who are the people that we should be talking to, both to come and serve on staff and on boards, and really to have some meaningful discussions. Because I think we need to have a better understanding of the adverse effects people are facing in different communities.
Right.
And, when I worked in the Clinton administration education, it was so very clear to me that if you were poor and you were more likely to be Black and brown, you were going to schools that by and large were inferior. I was in LA on a visit with the secretary, and we visited a couple of schools. Both were supposed to be really good schools. One was in a white area, one was in a Black area. The white area was like an exceptionally wonderful school. The Black area, the Black school that we went to, where we were visiting AP classes, etc., the school itself, there was flooding coming from a ceiling. Kids didn't have enough books, so they were sharing books. The disparities at that level, and then when you look from a disability perspective, and you look at the data around education, the dropout rates of kids who have disabilities, who are poor and Black and brown, where they're winding up in juvenile facilities and adult facilities, how the laws that we have in place, like 504, like IDEA, like others, are not being appropriately implemented. These are areas where I believe we really fundamentally need to get engaged, because we've got to move it beyond, we've got to move it to a resolution area, which is what NYAIL is all about. NYAIL really needed to move away from this is a problem to this is a solution.
Right.
And that's what NYAIL has been about. That's what Jim's been talking about, and Cliff and Denise. That's what we need to look at. What don't we know? How are we bringing our community, the diversity of our community, onto our staff, onto our boards, and how is this making a fundamental difference? And let me say one other thing, I'm sorry. Apparently 59% of college graduates recently are people of color, which is an amazing statistic and great. But I absolutely feel completely assured that most of those individuals are not identifying as having a disability. They're not seeing themselves a part of our movement. for many reasons. One is the stigma that they feel that they face and the way that they need to enter into the non-disabled world. So we really have to be continually looking at the visual of who we are, just like our absence in children's books, on and on, has a profound effect. And that's where I think we need to be really focusing. What are we doing? How do we get it out there? How do we expand what we're doing? How do we learn more? And how do we make our learning something that we are talking about?
I think that the millennia of discrimination that has occurred on the basis of disability has the same effect as 400 years of race discrimination on Black people. Obviously, the motive, the underlying rationale for the discrimination is completely different. With people with disabilities, it's low expectation, so we'll ignore them and whatever. But with Black people, it's much more visceral. It's hatred. It's bigotry. It's that kind of a response, and it's based on the fact that we officially considered Black people to be less than human as the law of the United States. Supreme Court
Harriet
decided.
Tubman had epilepsy.
There you go.
Shirley Chisholm had a disability.
Right.
There are many leaders, and I reference it in my book. There are many leaders in movements who have had disabilities that are not elevated because of their disabilities or as a part of who they are. And we need to do that.
Right. The stigma.
Right. Kennedy, Roosevelt, I mean, you can go on and on.
Right.
Sure, even James Madison had seizures.
Exactly.
Most people don't know that at all.
Right.
And along the lines of what Judy was mentioning earlier, we've also, the president of NYAIL established a task force to address many of these issues to help NYAIL modify and change our policies and practices to reach out to marginalized groups, to try to increase leadership. As a result of that, you just look at our conference, evolution of our
Revolution.
Thank you. Revolution is the name of our conference. We've had many workshops addressing this issue, and in fact, I'm a co-presenter at a workshop tomorrow dealing with how to become an anti-racist advocate. So, as I said, we're taking this very seriously and doing a lot to address this issue and educate as many people as possible.
You know, it's interesting that people feel this compunction to speak up. Not everyone, but some people do when they witness somebody without a permit park in a disabled parking area. I mean, able-bodied people, they know it's the wrong thing to do. They have this knee-jerk response. What are you doing? Save that space for somebody who needs it. You know, and they say things like that. But they don't have the nerve to do it when it comes to race discrimination. They just don't. They tolerate it. They watch it go on. On the other hand, they tolerate huge amounts of discrimination on the basis of disability because they're just unaware of it. You know, the handicap parking symbol, everybody knows, everybody can respond to it. I think if we speak up, if we involve the minority community in our leadership, it will be obvious what we're trying to do. I don't think people will go, look what they're doing, they're such phonies. I think we'll have racial minorities leading our movement. And that's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we need. First of all, the racial minorities are the majority, as somebody just pointed out, of college graduates a little earlier. They're going to be the majority of America soon anyway. So it's crazy not to get involved with.
Well, and disability doesn't discriminate. You know, it goes across all racial, ethnic, you know, economic categories. And so, you know, we have to have our movement reflect who is really a part of the movement, and it hasn't. The leadership.
The leadership has to look like it's right. The people that are in the movement, and if it doesn't, people won't believe it, and people won't trust it.
Right. Right.
So we're
we're
almost out of time right now.
You know, there's so much more we could be discussing. This could go on forever, and I do am sorry for those if we had questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. But I really do want to thank everybody for their participation today, taking the time out to have this conversation. I think the conversations need to go on, you know, not just about the Americans with this, what we accomplished with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but with the work that needs to continue. And so thank you, Jim, Judy, Cliff, for taking the time out today. And thank you, NYAIL, for sponsoring this workshop.
Thank you, everybody. And
Thank you,
buy
Judy.
my book. Buy my book called Being Human.
That's right.
That'd be great.
It's a great book. It's a great book. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. And if you're registered for the Nickel Conference, it starts at 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, you're going to be late if you don't hurry.
Thank you, everybody.
everyone.
Take care.
Keep telling
care,
the
Jim.
stories of good things that you're doing.
Yes.
Take care, Judy. Good to see you as always.
Bye.
Good to see you guys.
Take care, Jim.
Bye-bye.